learning. We all want our teams to do it. But today we're going to talk about what we need to do so we never stop learning. Welcome to the 114th episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Bradley Staats. Let me tell you about Brad. He says he wants me to call him Brad, so I'm happy to. So let me tell you about Brad. He is the author of the brand new book, Never Stop Learning. Stay relevant, reinvent yourself, and thrive. And if you're watching us, there's the picture of the book. He is an associate professor of operations at the University of North Carolina's Keenan Flagler Business School. His research examines how individuals, teams, and organizations can learn to improve their operational performance and to build competitive advantage, integrating work in operations management and organizational behavior to clarify how and under what conditions individuals, teams, and organizations can learn at their best. Listen, we are in for a good conversation. His work has been featured in places like Fast Company and the New Yorker, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, and after today, the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Brad, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks, Kevin. Real pleasure for me.
We had the chance to chat for just a couple of minutes before I hit record, and so I know this is going to be a great conversation, and I enjoyed the book. But before we get to the book, I want you to just tell us a little bit about your journey and your path. So you're a professor, but what's the background and how did you get to this being your focus? Just take us on that journey real quick.
Sure. Yeah. I think like most of us, it was a bit circuitous, figuring out the passion and what I really enjoy doing. So trained as an engineer, but then went into finance, worked at Goldman Sachs in investment banking, worked in strategic planning at Dell, worked in venture capital, got my own MBA in the middle of all of that at Harvard, and then kind of realized that I really loved the steep part of learning curves. I really loved digging in deep, and I was really curious why
clearly,
I saw.
You dove into all the deep end of all those things. So I would say that makes sense to everyone probably before you figured it out.
Yeah, no, definitely others. That's one of the takeaways is others are quite helpful in us guiding us through our paths, right? But had seen individuals and teams that I thought had similar resources but performed very differently, and kind of realized it was a story of learning. Wanted to know why some could learn and some couldn't, and so decided to go back to Harvard and get my doctorate. And then came from there down here to the University of North Carolina, where I've been kind of the last 9 years or so. So 14-year journey trying to make sense of learning, and that's really what the book is about.
And that is what the book is about. And when this, in doing this podcast, everybody, if you do a little inside baseball, people send us books all the time. And sometimes they send them without asking, and sometimes they ask. It all depends. And in this case, it wasn't Brad that sent it. It had an agency. And when I saw the title, I said, yeah, I want to see this book. I mean, so I resonated with the title before I got the book.
Yep.
And once I got it, I was all in. So here's the thing. I have written this, that human beings are learning beings. So react to that. I see you nodding, so that's a good sign, I suppose. Yep. But react to that statement. What's your thought about that statement?
Yeah, so I agree that we need to be learning beings, that our long-term success is dependent on that occurring. I think part of the premise of the book is that we get in our own way, right? And we stop that from happening. And so, trained as an operations professor, I saw the processes we needed to follow. And the engineer part of my brain said, great, we've got processes, now we just do it. And yet, even for myself, I find it so hard. And we look broadly, we see a lot of people struggling. And so, kind of while we should be learning beings, we aren't always.
Exactly. I mean, I believe we were built to be, and one of the premises of the book is we're not very good at it, even though we were built to, and even though we once were, I'll just say our age, which are not the same, clearly, but just by looking at our hair.
Directionally,
but functionally, once we get to adulthood, we're not. So let's talk about that. So why aren't we so good at it, even though maybe we were built to, and even maybe when we know all we're at our best when? Why not?
Yeah, well, and I think it's worth highlighting the exciting pieces we still can be, right? Even at our age, the research shows us, right? You can teach an old dog new tricks, but that old dog has to be willing to learn. Even kind of if we look at the neuroscience on the brain, it shows, right, we learn a little bit easier at a young age, but we can learn all through life. So I think that's, worth putting out there. Now, why don't we? There's a great Tolstoy quote from Anna Karenina that basically says all happy families look the same, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I think that's true of learning. Why don't we learn? We can not learn in all sorts of different ways, right? That oftentimes it's the organization we're a part of, that it kind of saps the will to do so out of us. It creates roadblocks that prevent us from doing so. But a whole lot of it is ourselves too, in that we judge, we need to act a certain way, we need to manage impressions, and then we don't do it, right? So take something as simple as failure. That everybody talks about it. It's learning 101 is fail fast, try new things, experiment, all of that. And yet,
everybody nods.
Unfortunately. Yeah, we all nod. We all know, amen, preach, but then when we actually get in the moment, we don't do it. We pull ourselves back. We're afraid of, how are we going to look if things go wrong? We try something and we fail, and instead of, okay, that went wrong, I admit it, now what can I learn? We blame the situation. Oh, it was somebody else's fault. And so that learning opportunity ends up getting lost. And so I think, that's the point of that we are, often the real challenge here.
Well, that's actually that's the title of one of the chapters. Why don't we learn from failure? So I'd actually like us to dive into a little bit more. And I'd like to talk first about the organizational, because you made a really interesting point. You sort of said something a minute ago that hopefully people heard, and you kept on going. But the point was that our organizations sometimes, I think the word you used was sap the ability for us to learn. So let's talk about this. Most everyone that is a lot listening or watching is a leader or is an aspiring leader. So let's think about that piece, that organizational learning piece first. We'll come back to failure a little bit more. The organizational learning piece as a leader, like what should we be doing so that we're not that organization that's sapping it out of people? Like what are the as a leader?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. I mean, so it starts by leading by example, right? That are we a learning leader ourselves? Are we leading to learn? Are we showing our teams, right, that we're learning beings, right, to use your language? And so I think if we're not doing that, people take our cues. They take their cues from what we do much more than what we say, and so they're going to watch us and see if we've kind of always got our head down. New ideas are irrelevant to us. We're not listening. Well, then why should they bother bringing us things, right? That's back to kind of the sapping the will to contribute. New people come into an organization not saying, I don't want to do things here, I don't want to take part. They want to build something great, and unfortunately, when the response is not there, then they end up giving up.
Well, so let me stop you right there for a second, because I think we've all got this vision, the leader's head down, working, right? And I think that what often happens isn't that the leader even is intentionally saying, I don't want new ideas. It's just that the way they're going about their work leads everyone to assume that that's the perception that's given off, right? So there are a lot of leaders who would say, well, I'm open to ideas, and they fundamentally are, but that's not what people see. So you're guessing me. So but say a little bit more about that, because I think there's a big part of that. Go ahead.
No, I mean, a lot of it is giving yourself space to do it, right? Because unfortunately, in the moment, it's always faster if you know what you're doing, if it's a task you've done before, to tell somebody else what to do, right? And unfortunately, I think as leaders, and I see myself with this problem sometimes too, we have so much going on that, we have 5 minutes for a task and that's it. And so when somebody has an idea or when they're struggling, we say, no, here, and we show them what to do, right? And we move on. Instead of actually trying to understand where they're coming from, teaching in that moment, finding something new, right? We turn them into automatons all too often. And so as a leader, that means creating that space. Making sure we're asking questions with someone rather than telling them what to do. And I think you're exactly right that not all, but most of us would say, absolutely, I want the new ideas. They're going to be better for the organization, but we just don't have any space to do it.
Yep. I think it's right on. So let's talk a little bit more about the failure piece.
Yep.
I try to close all the loops that I opened on you.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the failure piece, because you devote a whole chapter of the book to this idea of why don't we learn from failure. So let's talk about this on both.
Yep.
So why don't we personally do that? You mentioned some of this already. We're judging ourselves on stuff. Say a little bit more about that, then we'll talk about that organizationally too.
Yeah, exactly. And they build from one to the other, right? And I think, nothing leads to more conversations with, whether it's teaching, whether it's interacting with friends, than failure, because we all have this really awkward relationship with it. Failure is, it can be embarrassing. It can lead to shame. It can lead to anxiety. So it's understandable that we're a little bit averse to it. The research actually shows we activate similar sensors in the brain when we fail to physical pain. So that kind of that we feel really is our body responding. So it's not shocking. We want to avoid that. But the trouble comes, when we push it too far, right? That, we know that bad tends to overcome good, right? We overemphasize the negative outcomes. And so we're so concerned about what can go wrong. We get so obsessed with that upfront piece of, what happens if I try this and it doesn't work, that we never take that extra step, and what if it does work? Or alternatively, what if I don't try it? Am I not going to actually put myself in a worse position? And so that ends up kind of locking us into this fear of failure that, we have paralysis kind of through analysis, or just paralysis period, that we need to overcome.
Yeah, it isn't always analysis. Sometimes it's just straight out paralysis, right?
It's we think a little and we're screw that, we're moving on, and we're not going to address it, right? I think then.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please.
No. Well, what I was going to say is, so the first big problem is we don't take the jump in the first place, right? We don't actually try things out. The second piece then is what I was getting at of what happens when we actually try something and it doesn't work. Right? Are we then willing to engage in it seriously? Or, I think we certainly see this in other people. If we're really honest, we probably see some in ourselves that, we rolled the new product out, it didn't work. And looking back, we realized there's some fundamental mistake in the design, but instead, we say, well, nobody else could have been successful here, right? They weren't going to pull this off. Right? Yeah, we try to kind of wipe it off, right? Or we make a comparison of how it would have been even worse if we hadn't done it. When sometimes that's true, right? But all too often it becomes excuses.
It becomes the easy way out, right? It becomes the easy way out. Then we don't have to. Here's the word I want to talk about: reflect.
Yes.
Right. So you said sometimes we don't learn from failure because we never get a failure because we're afraid to try.
Yep.
Right. And then the second was when we do, we don't really want to talk about it. We don't really want to think about it. We don't really want to reflect on it. So can you talk about reflection just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think reflection is something that it's taken me a while to come to grips with it. That I'm absolutely a type A hard charger, that when I was a practicing manager and I went to leadership programs that had a journal, you were supposed to reflect, I kind of rolled my eyes if somebody wasn't looking at me, and, I would do it if they were watching, but otherwise maybe doodle or something, which I lots to learn for myself. But suddenly I was a professor and sometimes teaching in executive programs that had a learning journal. And so I felt rather disingenuous there. And much of my research is me search, questions that bug me. And so a colleague and I decided, hey, here's an opportunity for us to study this. And so what we did was we worked with a technology company in their service training, basically preparing folks to support customers. And so we took a 6-week program. And in the middle of that, we said, hey, we're going to randomly assign folks into 2 conditions, a treatment and a control, right? The treatment was simple. They're going to have 15 minutes at the end of the day to reflect. We're going to ask them just write about 2 things you learned today. That's it. And so, getting at this question of reflection, we then, had them do that for 2 weeks. At the end of this overall 6-week program, they took a test. They had to pass the test to go to the work and do it. They passed out at almost 25% higher rate. Their scores were also commensurately higher. And then their first month on the job, they performed at about a 10% higher level. And so as we dug into this, both our own lab studies, the research more broadly, what we see is reflection is incredibly powerful. It actually activates a different part of the brain than learning by doing. So we get kind of more of the brain going when we reflect versus when we do, which then you combine those together, right? You're more likely to learn. And yet we are incredibly resistant. Earlier, Brad, we say, I don't need to reflect. I just need to do it, right? Unfortunately.
Well, that leads to the point, because I hear this, I know you do too. I don't know, we haven't talked about it, but I'm sure you do. Well, Kevin, I learned by doing, or Brad, I learned by listening to a lecture or whatever it is.
Yep.
So they don't want, and assuming that those are flips of switches, like that's the only way. That may be your strength. So talk to that.
Sure.
How do you respond? How do you respond to the previous Brad, or how do you respond to people who say who are semi-aware of what their strength might be, but that's getting in their way because it's turning off everything else? How would you respond?
Yes. Yeah, no, so it's a great question. And I think this is where research is helpful, right? Looking across large samples, taking advantage of, randomization. On the learning styles front, we may have things that we like more. The research actually tells us that we can learn from all the different styles, that it's not you only have one style, this is how you learn. That kind of approach to the world turns out to be misguided. We did on this reflection piece, one of the studies is we gave people a choice. We let them, we gave them a new task. It was a math task. They did it. We taught them it. Then we gave them, you have 3 minutes. You can either keep practicing it or you can reflect about it. What's interesting is a little over 80% of people chose to do it. Only 20% reflected, but that reflection group then subsequently performed much higher. And then we've done it a lot of different ways, random assignment, et cetera.
Right.
And so I think that's how I try to talk to people is, yes, if you prefer one way, do that more often if you would like, but that doesn't mean you ignore the others.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you. So I've got 2 other, I am quite confident that we could do like 4 episodes here, but
thank you.
At least for now.
Yeah.
So I've got 2 other things I want us to talk about. And one of them is one that I talk with folks a lot, and maybe that's why I want you to talk about it. But
Perfect.
We're not good at self-awareness. Like we're not. Okay. So I want you to share some of the research to confirm for people that they're not good at it, because most people think they are. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that we think we understand ourselves better than we do, right? We were, in the open when you were talking about, my journey, and others probably saw it clearer. That happens consistently again and again. We often, see ourselves how we think we should be rather than how we are, or even how we want to be, right? That we have kind of this, design of what it should look like. And so, the research shows again and again, you name it, we overestimate it. You ask people, study of 1 million high school seniors, their leadership skills, over 70% said they had, above average leadership skills. Of course, we know the math doesn't work there. My favorite example is one that looked at professors asking them to rate their work, and 94% said they were above average.
94%.
So 94%, yeah.
My favorite one to tell women is that 70% of American men believe they are above average drivers, which of course they all laugh.
Yeah.
But again, it's the same thing. Exactly. It doesn't work, right?
No, it doesn't. And so, I think the question then is how do we do better, right? And part of the answer is knowing our likelihood of missing. And so kind of that, there's really interesting work around intellectual humility, kind of asking ourselves this question, what if I'm wrong, right? And not to the point of becoming paralyzed that then, you're huddling in a closet afraid to do anything.
Right.
But, I think I'm an above average leader. Well, what if I'm not? What evidence do I have to suggest I am? What evidence do I have to suggest that I'm not? The other piece that's incredibly important is being able to turn to others, right? And finding those people who will be the truth tellers to you, because the research does show that others do a shockingly good job of reflecting back to us what our strengths are. When have they seen us use them? When have they seen weaknesses? And then having those conversations. But of course, that means we have to build really strong relationships so that we can turn, the faculty member next door to me is somebody I can say, okay, Adam, you have to tell me, when I'm screwing up. And I'm not going to want to hear it. You may have to smack me upside the head, but it is your job, and I'm giving you full permission here as we're sitting here in a friendly conversation to do that. But that's hard for us to actually take that approach.
And I can tell you, as someone who, if we had members of my team parade across in front of this camera, they would say, well, Kevin, you may not be as good at this as you think, but I do know that there are times that I flat out say that to my team. Right?
Yep.
And I know that I'm not saying I do it perfectly by any stretch,
no.
but I know I do it, and I know it, and I know that they understand that, and I think I have pretty good relationships in general with my team, and they've said it's still hard.
Yes. Well, because you don't want to, even if they want it, we want to encourage those people, right? And so that's kind of the perverse thing. We can, if we're, sort of mean or close-minded, then nobody's going to tell us anything. And if we're incredibly nice, they're like, well, I don't want to hurt Kevin's feelings. I don't want to hurt Brad's feelings. And so to your point, some of it is continuing to open yourself up to it, right? When you ask people what they think and the first person disagrees, well, that's wrong, right? You actually stop and you listen.
You can't do the Brad eye roll.
No. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So you talk about an approach that I believe came from the University of Michigan, as much as it pains to say that, and long term, Michigan's a great school, but long term listeners might know that I went to Purdue, and so that's hard for me to say. But anyway,
sure, go Boilermakers.
Thank you. Anyway, so you talk in the book about this approach that you almost got there. You didn't quite go. Would you finish that out? Because I think that's a really great approach that people ought to consider. It's one of the things I loved about the book.
Yeah, thanks. So there is this tool, the Reflected Best Self-Exercise, that came out of the Center for Positive Organizational Studies out of Michigan. And it's a great approach. What you do is you basically ask 10 to 15 people that know you well, ideally from all facets of your life. So it could be people you work with now, but also, a childhood friend or a college professor or prior colleagues, to write 2 or 3 stories of when they have seen you at your best. So in this case, you're not asking for weaknesses, you're asking for your strengths. So 2 or 3 times they've seen you at your best. You then assemble these stories into a report. And so there are folks that'll do it for you, but you also could do it for yourself. And then you go through those stories and you read, what do they remember about you? And what's so interesting is some of them will be stories that, you recall well, and yes, that was a good moment for me. Way to go, Brad. You did it. Right. But there are others having done it that you've forgotten almost, that you didn't think this had an impact. You didn't think anyone noticed. And what's so powerful about that is as you sit there, as you really back to reflection, kind of work your way through it, you start to see some trends. Right? You start to see, how you've impacted others, where they've seen you at your best. And with that as identification, then it's thinking about how can you incorporate more of that in your life, more of that in your work to really help yourself thrive.
By the way, I always tell listeners there's 2 or 3 times in every episode that makes it all worth listening, and there's one of them right there. There's one other thing, and we're past halfway. We're moving on here, Brad, but I got one more thing from the book that was something I didn't know at all before I was reading. And it's this idea of optimal distinctiveness. Can you talk about optimal distinctiveness just a minute? Because it was fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the start of kind of that chapter, and I think the point of optimal distinctiveness as well, is the power of authenticity. That we really learn the most when we are ourselves, when we back to bringing out our strengths, bringing out kind of who we are. And then, unfortunately, in too many organizations, we feel like, okay, I need to act like everyone else. I need to put on my power tie, have my suit on, and kind of disguise myself behind the clothes and the words. And that's just wrong. Thankfully, that what we see is instead that authentic self-expression is both. It's better for our health. It's better for our motivation, makes us more likely to learn. And so, I've done and with colleagues a bunch of research around that, showing basically when you highlight the individual, really interesting study in Indian organization in the onboarding stage on day one, highlighting, hey, let's talk about who you are, why you're glad to be here, introduce yourself around kind of you, give you a fleece at the end of it with your name on it to remind you of that, and then that's it. An organizational condition of how great the company is, why you're glad to be here, it was a good company, and then the fleece with the company name on it. Randomly assign folks to conditions. 6 months later, they're more likely to be in the firm still, they're more likely to perform at a higher level, kind of that individual matters. And so that's really the first part of the curve, that performance goes up with the individual coming out. But, and this is where optimal distinctiveness is important, we can go too far, right? We do need to understand our organizational norms. That's
why there's an optimum, right?
That's why it's exactly right. There is a point at which, this is the operations right in me. There's a point at which you're going to be at your best. That if you're in most organizations, showing up barefoot with your dog and your shirt unbuttoned is probably not going to lead you to success. Now, there's some that somewhere that point varies, right? Yeah. But you need to understand the bounds, because the issue is if you push it too far, then you turn people off, right? Then they're no longer going to listen to you. And so that's, I think, the struggle. And for most people, we put ourselves at, too restricted, right? That we would actually benefit from a little bit more us coming out. But we do need to recognize that if we go too far, then we become the problem, not the other people. And so what I'd say is, for most of us, try a little bit more and see how it goes. Try a little bit more, see how it goes, with this awareness of you can go too far.
I think that's really great. So we've been talking with Brad Staats about never stop learning, stay relevant, reinvent yourself, and thrive. And so, Brad, the next piece I want to talk about real quick is what we call our fast break. I've got 3 ideas for you.
Okay.
I'm going to say one. I just want you to give me your first reactions to it, sentence or whatever, about each of these. Okay. Are you ready?
Sure. Ready.
The first one is coaching.
Yes, do it. So, I think this is the piece. Coaching and practice are things that as an athlete you would never go without, right? I mean, it's just a given for whatever sport you play that you do those things. And somehow we think in business or in our organizations that, no, it's time for us to do. But of course, a coach can help us. A coach can, back to that, somebody else to reflect back on us, somebody that we can take hard feedback to and walk through it with. Yep. So I'm a big fan. You obviously have to find the right person who's a good fit, who's well trained, that you can interact with. But yes.
Okay. Second one is change.
Yeah, I mean, it's trite to say it's hard, but it's, I think that's the right place to start. We don't want to. It's a lot more comfortable sticking where we are. And so, I think, accepting the inevitability of it, for me at least, part of how I deal with change is knowing that even if I try to stay in my shell and don't adjust, the world is changing around me. And so that makes it a little bit easier that it's not me kind of breaking the world to do this. It's breaking all around. And so change is going to happen regardless. It's whether I'm going to be an active participant or be passive to it.
There you go. And the last one is performance management.
broken. Unfortunately, I think most organizations, performance management is so focused on the outcome that we really miss the process, that we miss the opportunity to learn. And so the problem is if all we do is focus on, that final number, if we're sales or whatever it might be, then of course people are going to manage to it in some really, disruptive ways. And so thoughtful organizations are going to figure out, and we see a bunch of companies doing this now, how do we reinvent performance management? And I think that's probably an area that we're going to see the most change over the next decade or so, as companies take that really seriously, recognizing that, what we've done for the last century isn't good for people and it isn't good for companies.
We could go back to the coaching word was going to be part of the solution. And I want everyone to notice this is an operations guy who's saying this. So you ought to take it seriously. Okay. So Brad, when you're not teaching executives, teaching in a classroom, doing research, writing books, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, so I spend a whole lot of time on baseball fields. So I have 3 kids, 3 boys, 9, 11, and 13, all of whom play baseball, and I help coach each of their teams. So most nights during the week, you'll find me out coaching baseball, which is a lot of fun. And then one of the great things about my job is it creates travel opportunities. And so I really enjoy that, both working with organizations, but also with the family, trying to sneak off to places.
Beautiful. And so as I ask every week, I'll ask you, what are you reading now, or what's something you've read recently that people might find useful?
Yeah, so I just finished up Last Place on Earth by Roland Huntford that tells the story of Scott and Amundsen and their race to the South Pole. And, I think it's a great adventure story. Obviously, it turns out, not so well for one of the two, but it's really a powerful leadership book. I think if you look at how Scott leads his team in a very transactional way, and how that creates some real problems in a complex, uncertain environment. And then you look at Amundsen really leading in a transformational way. Both of them have their problems on the way. But I mean, what strikes me as so fascinating is, right, it's over 100 years ago. They're trying to do something that most of us thankfully wouldn't, of going to the South Pole. But there are a lot of parallels to leading in today's rapidly changing environment that I think listeners might enjoy.
And I think because the book does juxtapose the two, as opposed to just telling the story of the winner, it makes it a better book. So the question you've been wanting me to ask is, where can people learn more about the work, and where can they get the book and that sort of thing?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So website's bradleystaats.com. So BradleyStaats.com. Love to have folks follow me on Twitter at BRStaats. And then certainly please check out the book at Amazon, and all the places you might normally go. But I appreciate the chance to share.
All right. Excellent. And now my question for all of you who are listening, and that is, now what? Yes, it is the reflective question. And yes, it is the question of action. So what did you get from the last 31 minutes of conversation that you found useful? But not just what did you find useful, but what might you take action on? So I'm going to challenge you, as I do every week, to make this actionable. And to do that, you're going to have to reflect. And you may have been listening to us as you exercised or biked or drove or whatever. But I want you to stop and think about, what was the thing that I got? Maybe it's the reflective best self. Maybe it's an insight that you got about having coaching. Maybe it's something about optimal distinctiveness. Whatever it might have been, I challenge you to think and take action. And so, Brad, thanks for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. I was looking forward to it, and it was even better than I expected. So thank you for being here, and thank all of you for joining us. And so we've been talking about the book, Never Stop Learning. Stay relevant, reinvent yourself, and thrive. And this episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Leader. So what you really ought to do is go buy both. And I will leave you all with that. And I will hope that you all come back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.